Some time ago, up in the cabin, there were a group of young boys sitting around the campfire and began telling stories. And finally, we began talking about religion. And you know what happens when you start talking about religion? You get to talking about things you don't actually know what you're saying. So we began talking about this man, Judas. And many of us were coming up with some false accusations, and we realized that we really didn't know what we were talking about. So that was an incentive for me for my talk, which is entitled The Kiss of Judas. It is based on a portion of scripture taken from Luke, chapter 22, verses 45 through 49. But Jesus said unto him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? Also a passage of scripture from John. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit. Judas. What impression do you have when you hear that word? Is it an impression of greatness, goodness, and mercy? Or is it an impression of lowliness, betrayal, something evil? There are many stories of betrayal, such as the story of Benedict Arnold. As you know, he plotted the betrayal of his country. Then, of course, going back into history to Rome, Brutus, who betrayed Caesar. But of all the acts of treachery that have blackened the pages of human history, the most perfidious and heartless is that of Judas Iscariot, when he betrayed his master with a kiss. Now this betrayal stands without a parallel in all the annals of false and faithless friendship. All of us know the story of the betrayal of Christ, and every time I hear the story, I can't help asking myself, what am I to think of this man who betrayed his master with a kiss? We know nothing of Judas, the traitor, save what we read about him in the scripture. What therefore shall we think of him as we read the story of his treachery? Well, I have examined this man Judas from two standpoints. The first one is the problem of his discipleship. The second one is the problem of his personality. First of all, I'd like to take this problem of his discipleship. What type of person, or why did Christ call Judas to be a disciple in the first place? We must remember that Jesus knew from the beginning who it was that should betray him. And in the early part of his ministry, didn't he say, have I not chosen you 12, and one of you is a devil? And we must not forget the fact that Jesus knew from the beginning who it was that should betray him. And the betrayal was both in the foreknowledge of God and unerringly predicted in the Old Testament. But the scriptures does not leave Judas in the least of the responsibility of the unthinkable. Of course, I know that God foreknows all things, not because the Bible tells me so, but how could he be God if he didn't? But I also know that I am a free moral agent and that I must choose and do choose for myself. By choosing for myself as I do, and choosing for yourself as you do, we must both of us know that no one but ourselves is to be held responsible for the choice we make. We could apply the portion of scripture here, God be merciful to me a sinner. Now in the second place, we have the problem of his personality. What kind of man was this Judas? What kind of man was he when Jesus chose him to be an apostle? Well, there are those that affirm that Judas was a devil from the beginning, but no such record is found in the scriptures. The record does not say that Judas was a traitor, but that he became a traitor. Now, no man could become a traitor if he was one from the beginning, could he? Now, had Judas been a hypocrite when he offered his service to Jesus, it's hardly to be supposed that Jesus would have accepted him. For Jesus knew what was in man and needed not that anyone should tell him. We can also see where Judas must have been trusted by the other 11 disciples. As you know, the 12 disciples lived in a communal type of society, and everything they had went into what we could call a common pot. Their clothing, their food, their money, everything was in a common treasury. Now Judas was elected to be treasurer of this pot, And it seems that they must have trusted him, because even today we don't like men to be treasures of our clubs or societies unless they are of trustworthy character. Now, going back to the childhood days of Judas, we see that they must have been days of good parental influence. Do you know what the name Judas means? Well, the name Judas means the praise of God. In giving their child this name, the parents must have been hopeful of a godly future, and of course would guard their influence over this child for this end. And then for 3 years, this child, when he became a young man, had lived in close fellowship with Jesus, who had done his loving best, and yet he became a traitor. He betrayed his master with a kiss. $18.60 is exactly what Judas received. Or as in the Bible, it says 30 pieces of silver. Now, this isn't very much money for a deed that would influence society and people for many, many years. I can't help but think, why didn't Judas come back? You know, Peter turned again to the Lord and received the loving, precious kiss of forgiveness. Now, why didn't Judas come back? I am sure if Judas had done that, when the angel rolled away the stone and Jesus came forth, I think he would have said, "Go tell the disciples." And Judas. Last summer, I spent the whole summer at a church camp, and at the beginning of the week, I was asked to deliver a Vesper service. I didn't know quite what to say to these young people, and as I was sitting in my bunk, I began reading some stories and information, trying to find something to say to these people. I found an example that I thought was very enlightening. I'd like to pass it on to you now. Judas, after he betrayed Christ, ran back to the temple. He threw the pieces of silver down in front of the priest, then ran out and hung himself. The tree on which Judas hung himself didn't have a name at that time, but since has been named the Judas tree. The Judas tree grows in Pennsylvania and throughout the United States, but it doesn't grow quite as big as it does in the Holy Land. Now, the Judas tree is very much like our peach tree. In the springtime, they both bring forth beautiful buds. They make promises of bearing fruit at the end of the summer. All summer long, they keep this promise. Then finally, at the end of the summer is when a big difference occurs. The peach tree, as many of us know, brings forth delicious sweet fruit. The Judas tree bears no fruit at all. It makes a promise and doesn't keep it. I told these youth that they could liken their lives unto the Judas tree, or they could liken their lives unto the peach tree. I know they all made promises to a church. They all make promises to their different organizations that they belong to the church. And I asked them how many of them actually kept their promises. Well, I feel that many of them did, because they were at the church camp and there's a religious group. I could ask you the same question. Now, in closing, I'd like to include some thoughts from William Bidewell's Book of Sermons. Master's marvelous mercy of Jesus, you need it, and with it, his wonderful forgiveness. Isn't the way along which we have followed the life of this unhappy soul, after all, a somewhat familiar road? This next part is very important, I feel. There are other ways to betray one's Lord. I aim this next part especially towards the women, but I don't think that it should be directly aimed at them, because it certainly includes men too. Don't be too quick in judging another, even though he be a Judas. How many of us gossip about our neighbors? How many of us judge other people? But for the grace of God, you might be a Judas yourself. And if you are not aware of the the possibility of a Judas within yourself, it is not because you are so good, but because you have failed to appreciate the awful truth that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. That's human nature. We all are sinners. We all need to go to God asking for forgiveness. Grace there is my every debt to pay, blood to wash my every sin away, power to keep me spotless day by day. For me, and for you.